Shavua Tov. This past Shabbat was Parshat Mishpatim from the book of Shemot, the book of Exodus. And it was also Shabbat Rosh Chodesh, which is the first day of what's called First Adar, because it's a Hebrew leap year. The Talmud says, Shenichnas Adar marbim simcha. When Adar enters, it's a time of joy. I'd like to say a few words, which I said the Shabbat, about Parshat Mishpatim. So we'll take it from here. Now, last week was Parshat Yitro, and Parshat Yitro has the famous 10 Commandments from chapter 20 in the book of Shemot, which is the first 10 Commandments in the Torah, because it's also in the book of Devarim, Deuteronomy. And Parshat Mishpatim goes from what I call the ideal, which is the 10 Commandments, and it brings it into the real of how to run a society. What is the difference between Parshat Yitro and Mishpatim, which seem to go together? First of all, I want to prove that they go together. I'll give you a few proofs. One of them is that if you take the 10 Commandments, which are mentioned last week, you will find that each one of them are also mentioned in this week's Parsha, Mishpatim. For instance, last week, the 10 Commandments starts off with an introduction. I am the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt, which is considered the first of the utterances. According to Rambam, there's also a mitzvah here, but I'll put that aside at the moment. And in this week's Parsha, in chapter 21:20, it says, because you were ki gerim hayitem be'eretz Mitzrayim, you were strangers in the land of Egypt. And then last week it says, you shall not have other gods besides me. And then this week's Parsha, also in chapter 21:19, it says, Zovech l'Elohim yochoram. Anybody who gives an offering to a foreign god will be yochoram, will be expelled. Bilti l'Hashem levado. Only to God can you bring offerings. And also it says, and in 23:73 of this week's parsha, V'shem Elohim acharim lo taskiru. Do not even mention the names of other gods. Let it not be upon your lips. And then the third of the 10 Commandments, do not take God's name in vain. Lo tisat shem alecha lashav. This week's part it says, Elohim lo takalel, do not curse God. V'nasi b'amcha lo ta'or, and also not the leaders. And Rashi says, it's both not to curse God and not to curse the judges. Remember the Sabbath day, which is the fourth commandment of last week. And it says in this week's Parsha, 6 days shall you do all your activities, and on the seventh day you shall rest, in order that your ox and your donkey will rest, and also your servants and the stranger in your midst. That's also 23, verse 23, 12. And then it says, Kabet avicha v'etimecha, which is commandment number 4, which is to honor your father and mother. And in this week's Parsha, Mishpatim, it says somebody who smites, who hits their father and their mother, it's the death penalty. And if they curse their father and mother, it's a death penalty, right? That's, I think, 22:15, 22:17, and it sounds quite, 21:15, 21:17, and it sounds quite serious, of course. Then it says, last week's Parsha, Lo Tirtzach, do not murder. And this week's Parsha says, Makeish v'met mot yumat. If a person smites somebody and they die, they get the death penalty. Last week's Parsha, which is last week's Parsha says, Lo tin'af, number 7. This week's Parsha, you can say from inference, it's mentioned, because it says if somebody seduces an unwed woman, that's in 22:15, and has relations with her, then he has to marry her and give a mohar, a dowry, to the family, which means, of course, if she was in another situation, it would be much more, the penalty would be more extreme, but that's why I call it from inference. Then it says last week's Parsha, Lo tignov, do not steal, which according to the Talmud is referring to kidnapping. There are reasons for it, why the Talmud says that. And in this week's Parsha, it says somebody who steals another person, meaning kidnaps another person, and sells them. Vinim sabiyado, and there's witnesses, mot yumat, they receive the death penalty. That's also 21:16. Last week it says, Lo tanabri achayit shaker, do not bear a false testimony. And this week it says, Lo tisa shem hashav, al tashet yadcha im rasha, do not add your hand to a wicked person in order to be a false witness. That's in 23:2. And then the last of the 10 commandments, not to covet things which are not yours. Now here, it's not mentioned in this way because not to covet is something which is in your mind. And in halakhic reasoning, something which has no action and no verbal expression cannot be punished by a court of law, a human court of law. And in this week's Parsha, it's all about things in human society. So this week's Parsha only mentions if you steal, if you create damage, but will not mention something which is in the mind. But in general, you have this reflection of the 10 commandments in this week's Parsha. Now, the connection is also made by the Midrash. In Midrash Rabbah, on this Parsha, the great Midrash, it says on Parshat Mishpatim. So the Midrash on this Parsha says, and I quote, it's number 9, chapter 39, Eila Mishpatim, these are the laws, as it says in Tehillim, in the Psalms 147, Magid Varav Li'Yaakov, Magid Varav Li'Yaakov, who speaks his words to Jacob, Chukav Mishpatav L'Yisrael, his laws and precepts to Israel, Lo Asachen Chogoy, he did not do such to any other nation. King David says in the Psalms. So the Midrash darshans this, expresses this, or explains this like this. Magid V'Rav Yaakov, he spoke words to Jacob, that is referring to the 10 commandments, which were spoken at the beginning. Chukav Mishpatav Yisrael, his laws and precepts to Israel, this is referring to the precepts of this week's Parsha, which are called Mishpatim. So the Midrash makes a connection between Parshat Yitro, which is the 10 commandments, and the Mishpatim, the precepts of this week's commandments. And it bases it on this drasha, on this interpretation of the Psalms. There's the things that he said to Jacob, and then there are the Mishpatim that he gave to Israel. Now it's interesting though, in the Midrash Tanchuma, which is also a midrash from antiquity, they darshan this slightly different. On the same verse, Magid V'Rav Yaakov, who says his words to Israel, Chukav Mishpatah. So the Midrash Tanchuma separates between the word chok and mishpat. Now, very often we separate chok and mishpat, meaning that chok are, let's say, the laws between man and God, and mishpat are the laws between man and man. But the Midrash says, Chukav, that's the Torah. Mishpat, those are the dinim. What's the difference? So I explain it actually sort of similar to the way Midrash Rabbah. Chukot is the Torah. Torah meaning the relationship with God is the idea of the Torah. And that's why when the 10 commandments were spoken to Israel, we call that the giving of the Torah. Because the point of the Torah is to connect the individual and the people with God. What does it mean, mishpatim or dinim? When they use the term dinim, which also means laws, it seems to refer to the laws that regulate society. And this week's Parsha of Mishpatim is really all the laws are how to run a just society. That is the point of this week's Parsha. So you have the general, what I call the ideals of Judaism, the 10 commandments. And with these ideals, there was a covenant, which is mentioned at the end of this week's Parsha, a covenant between God and Israel at the time of the commandments, at the time that the 10 commandments were spoken to Israel. This is what Rashi says on this week's Parsha, that even though it's mentioned at the end of this week's Parsha, this covenant at Sinai, the covenant of Chorev, but it happened juxtaposition to last week's Parsha at the same time. So therefore, the 10 commandments represent the ideal. They represent the relationship between God and Israel, which is formulated through this covenant at Sinai. And they become a reality and how to transform them into reality in society through the Mishpatim, through the laws which are given in this week's Parsha. I call it the constitution of how to build this just society when you come into the land of Israel. So this is the relationship between these two parshiot. I'd like to add one other thing. In this very unusual midrash, I mean, what we're going to hear is very unusual. The midrash which I just quoted from Midrash Rabbah number 9, they have a very interesting story, and I want to explain this too. The midrash says there is a story, and wait, before I have to quote you the continuation, it says God's ways are different from human ways. Human beings, when they command their people to do something, like a king, the people have to do it, the king doesn't have to do it. But when God commands Israel, he does it too. He keeps his precepts. Now, why would God have to keep his precepts? First, I'll give the example which is brought here, and which will make it even more unusual, but then I'll explain. There's a story with Rabbi Gamliel, 2nd century, and Rabbi Joshua, and Rabbi Lezer ben Azariah, and Rabbi Akiva, all of them 2nd century Tanaim, scholars of the Mishnah. Shalchul Romi, they went to Rome, V'darshu sham, and they gave this interpretation that the ways of the Lord are different than the ways of human beings. That when God tells people to do something, he also abides by the rules. I'm sure the Romans were not happy to hear that. But anyhow, Hayasha min, the term min in Hebrew, in the Midrash, is referring to a Jew who turned, an apostate Jew, a Jew who turned away from Judaism. And he came over to them and said, what do you mean? You're giving lies. How could God keep his Torah? You're saying that God says and does what he does, but God doesn't keep the Sabbath, the Shabbat. They said to him, what do you mean? Why not? He says, what do you mean? It says that God makes the winds blow and the rain to come. So that means that he's carrying on the Sabbath. You're not allowed to carry in a public place. So they answered him, well, for God, it's not a public place, because it says in Isaiah, it says in Isaiah that God's glory fills all of the universe. And it also says that in Jeremiah 23, I fill the heavens and I fill the earth. So a person is allowed to carry in the place where they're standing. So if God fills the heavens of the earth, it's not considered carrying in a public place. He doesn't have to go anywhere because he's just picking it up, right? In the place where you are. And that's why, okay. Now that seems like a very strange thing. First of all, why does God have to keep the precepts and the commandments? What does that even mean? And this question of how does God keep the Sabbath, even if the guy was right or wrong, why would God have to keep the Sabbath? Why would God have to keep those mitzvot? What does it actually mean? So, I want to explain this in such a way. The guy who was asking the question, very often you have this in the Midrash, that some guy who's not a good guy asks a question, and they dochim oto bakash, we say in Hebrew. They push him off of the straw, which means they don't give him the real answer, just to get rid of him. You asked a crazy question, what we call in Yiddish a klotz kasha, I'll give you a crazy answer. God it's not called carrying because he fills the heavens and the earth. But that's not the truth of the meaning of what they want to say. What they want to say is like this. You have to differentiate for a moment between what I call the laws between man and man, or what human beings understand to be morality, and the laws which is called Mishpatim, and the laws between man and God, which we call Chukim. And the difference is, the Torah has two types of laws. There are the laws which are the just society according to the Torah, and that's this week's Parsha, Mishpatim. Also in Leviticus chapter 19, which is Parshat Kedoshim in Vayikra. And these are the laws of how to run a just society according to the Torah, which are very interesting, by the way. I call them the Constitution, There's a lot to try to understand of how the Torah sees society. That's why it's very important to learn this. Secondly, but then there are also the laws that are to teach us spiritual ways, like the Sabbath, like the way we keep the holidays, like tefillin, like prayer. There are a lot of things that are to build us up spiritually. But as Rabbi Kook writes in one place, there are two levels. If you're not a moral person, you'll never learn how to be a spiritual person. You cannot build a house without a basis. You can't build the second floor before the first floor. Learning to be an ethical person is the first floor. As we say in Hebrew, derech eretz kadma Torah, which means being a good person or an ethical person comes before Torah, which means comes before learning how to connect to God. Because if you're not a good person, the connection to God will never be normal for you. It will be meaningless. Because it's a certain sensitivity that you won't be able to develop if you don't already have a sensitivity towards your fellow human being. Now, the first thing the rabbis are trying to say here, or the second century of rabbis, is that, what does it mean God keeps the precepts? Actually, it says so in the Torah itself, in Deuteronomy, in Parshat Hazinu. El emunah ve'en avel, tzadik v'yasharhu. It says in Deuteronomy, chapter 31, chapter 32, El emunah, God is a faithful God. Ve'en avel, he doesn't do anything, any iniquities. Tzadik v'yasharhu, he is righteous and he is honest. Meaning God keeps what he says. When God promises mankind something, he does it. God will not punish without reason. And God is compassionate. So in that sense, yes, what we understand as ethical, God understands as ethical too. But what about the mitzvot between man and God? Does God have to keep the Sabbath? No. Does God have to put on tefillin? No. So what is that all about? Why don't they just say certain precepts? I'll explain why. There's a place in the Talmud, in the tractate of Brachot, blessings, right in the first chapter. And the Talmud also says on the verse, Nishpa Hashem biyamino v'yizro zo. God takes an oath in his right hand and in the hand of strength. So the Talmud in Brachot said his right hand refers to the Torah. Uvizro zo, his hand of strength, that refers to the tefillin, which is on the other hand, on the left hand. The right hand is Torah, then the left hand is the tefillin. But then the Talmud asks the question, he says, does God have tefillin? What does that mean? Why would God have tefillin? And the Talmud says, yes. But then the Talmud says, but what would it say in God's tefillin? Because after all, in our tefillin, when we put on the phylacteries and the sign on the head and the arm, so it says in our tefillin, hear, O Israel, the Lord is God, and the Lord is one, taken from Devarim, Deuteronomy chapter 6, and also chapter 11 of Deuteronomy. But what would it say in God's tefillin? God knows that God is one. Talmud says in God's tefillin, it says, and who is like the people of Israel, one nation in the land? Which means, just like God wants us to learn how to be spiritual and connect to God, God is interested in creating a relationship with mankind. And therefore, when God makes promises in the Torah, he keeps them. What are his promises? I'll give you some examples. It says in Deuteronomy, Devarim, Parshat Bechukotai, which is chapter 28, Va'af gamzot be'eretz oivehem, and even when the Jews are in the lands of the enemies in the diaspora, lo me'astim, I did not despise them. V'lo azavtim, I never left them. La'afer biti talmin, I never broke my covenant with them. And then it says, V'zacharti et briti Yaakov, I shall remember the covenant of Jacob, and the covenant of Isaac, and the covenant of Abraham, and the covenant with the land. God makes many promises, like in Deuteronomy 30, Devarim chapter 30, how he's going to bring the Jews back, how the exile will be over. All these promises, God keeps his promises. Human leaders, they make promises before they get elected. They get elected, they don't keep it. So yeah, the people have to keep the law. The people made the promises. The elected leaders don't have to. But when God promises the Jewish people something, he keeps his promises, which means he keeps his commands, even the commands that he said he's going to do towards his people and towards the world. He said, I won't bring another deluge. There won't be another deluge over the world. So this is what the rabbis are saying, that God is different than a human leader. A human leader says, okay, these are the laws, and then they make promises, but their promises, they don't keep it. Sometimes even the laws they don't. God makes promises and he keeps them all. And because he also is an ethical God, he's a God of justice and a God of compassion. Therefore, he never goes back on his word. As we say in the prayers, the things that you promise will never turn back. And all the promises of Ezekiel and of Isaiah and of Jeremiah, the promises of comfort and the promises that he will always have the covenant with his people. And we remember these things in the difficult times that we are going through now with this war in the south, with the Hamas, in the north with Hezbollah. God will never forsake his people. And he will remember the covenant of Jacob, of Isaac, of Abraham, and the covenant with the land. God will never forsake his people and will never forsake his land. And he shall never forsake his people for the sake of his holy name. Shalom, shalom. And may we have a great week.